In Toronto here, we're remembering a great Shakespearean Canadian actor, Christopher Plummer. He was born in Toronto, grew up in Quebec, and he performed at Stratford, Ontario for almost 70 years. He's especially remembered in Canada for his generosity to so many authors, and also to so many actors that he worked with. A really wonderful man. Everybody loved him. Today we're talking about Mary Sidney, and I'm going to try to give new evidence that supports her authorship. My sister Anne introduced me to Mary Sidney's life and work from her friend, Dr. Robin Williams in Santa Fe. So Bill Yeomans, who's here today with Anne, wrote our book called Shakespeare's Puzzles, Anne's title, by the way, The Woman Who Created Shakespeare, which is an attempt to answer that question, address the question with abundant new evidence that I've studied. The first book to advocate for Mary Sidney's authorship was in 1931, Gilbert Slater's 7 Shakespeares, comparing 7 different candidates. Slater proposed that De Vere started Shakespeare's career. Then Mary Sidney wrote the great plays after 1600 as a really accomplished poet that was admired by so many other poets. This idea, however, was ridiculed. How could a woman be William Shakespeare? Yet, if you read the plays, strong women dominate the poems and the plays of Shakespeare. I'll show you that all the poems have a leading woman character. They're often wearing men's clothes, hiding the way that Mary Sidney did, but they are always strong, smart women in these plays. According to Sir Mark Rylance of Shakespeare's Globe in London, this summer, he said, the best women's roles ever written are in Shakespeare's plays at the authorship meetings. Now, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare's sonnets and early plays. Last April, I discussed those plays as the main consideration. The reason is that the sonnets were dedicated to William Herbert, W.H., who is often identified as Mary Sidney's first son, William Herbert. There's a lot of discussion of sons in the sonnets, and William Herbert is her first son. Why was William Herbert the candidate for W.H.? Well, the first folio was dedicated to William and Philip Herbert, who were the 2 sons of Mary Sidney Herbert and the Earl of Pembroke, Henry Herbert. So why those 2 were the focus of both of these great works, the legacy works of Shakespeare. If you go down, it'll show the 2 legacy works. To the next slide, Sylvia. Okay, so there's the thanks for everybody. The legacy is then Shakespeare's sonnets to W.H., written by our ever-living poet. The first folio was dedicated to William and Philip Herbert, presumably the same William Herbert. The 3rd and 4th Earls of Pembroke, with their father being the 2nd Earl of Pembroke, Henry Herbert. So I want to try to explain why these Herberts are so important in Shakespeare's legacy works, as well as in the early plays. The family story in the sonnets, however, differs from the first folio story. The sonnets talk about a family that needs a son. However, the first folio story talks about a Stratford actor who left his family and whose son had died in 1595. So why is he talking about his son? So let's go down again. The Herberts are shown here. William Herbert, the son, 3rd Earl, Mary Sidney Herbert, the great poet, the Countess of Pembroke, and Henry Herbert, the 2nd Earl. Now, in the sonnets, the son is called Will in the Dark Lady sonnets, and in the dedication, he's called W.H. And he seems to be interested in women, especially his Dark Lady. Mary Sidney Herbert is the young mother who loves beauty also the famous poet, the Countess of Pembroke. And the sonnets talk about the mother loving beauty and seeing the beauty of her son reflected in thy mother's glass in Sonnet 3. By contrast, Henry Herbert was interested in his wealth, and he needed an heir to pass on his wealth and his title because his first two wives had not produced a son. She was his third wife, 15 years old to his 40 years. He needed an heir for his power. She needed poetry for beauty, and he was interested in women. Now, if we go down to the next slide, we can talk about the family that she came from. She was a poet and grew up in a family of poets. Her older brother was Sir Philip Sidney, and he wrote Astrophel and Stella, his famous sonnets, Star and Star Lover, and Defense of Poesy, his essay when he returned from Italy. She wrote many sonnets, 3 sonnets in 1593 for Gabriel Harvey, in which she said that she had written an old comedy as a satire about Nash Arduccio, which I'll talk about Thomas Nash. Okay. On the right is their younger brother, Robert Sidney, who was the governor of Flushing. And he collected the poems called The Phoenix Nest. Okay. Can you hear? Is it loud or too loud? The Phoenix Nest included poems from the Earl of Oxford, and they were dedicated to Philip Sidney, his older brother, as well as the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, their uncle, both of whom had died a few years before. Okay, so if we go to the next one, I'll talk a little bit more about Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney went to Venice and Padua for 11 months in 1573 and 4 to study the poets and the politics of Venice. Queen Elizabeth loved Venice, both the politics and the culture. When he returned, he wrote Defense of Poesy, advocating for English poems in the Italian style. After he died in 1586, in battle with Robert in the Netherlands, by the way, after he died, Mary Sidney then led their large circle of poets at her house in Wiltshire. She then rewrote, edited, and completed all of Philip's major works and called it here the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. The first was written in 1593, the year of Venus and Adonis. And then in 1598, she included all of his essays and major works. He is shown on the left here as a traveling poet, like a statue, like a Greek statue, whereas she is shown on the right as a statue that looks like the goddess of wisdom and war. That is Minerva in Rome or Pallas Athena in Greece. She's wearing her armor, she's carrying her spear at her side, and she looks like the warrior character. He looks like the poet, even though he died in battle as a warrior. This is often used in other cover pages, but this was the original for the 1593 version. This was a very successful folio edition. So we can call it the first folio, but in this case, the first folio of Sir Philip Sidney, written as the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, was republished many times with stories that were later used by Shakespeare, such as King Lear and Cymbeline. As a result of this picture and her work, Mary Sidney was often called the goddess of wisdom, Minerva or Pallas Athena, by the other poets. And I'll quote some of their dedications. One of these republications was in 1625, 4 years after she advanced this one, after she died in 1621. This was one that was prepared in French for Marie de Medici, the Queen of France. And it had a beautiful frontispiece with showing Mary and Sidney and Philip together. The left picture shows Philip Sidney as Apollo. And the poem below says he climbs Apollo's mount. And he is wearing the laurel wreath of a great poet. And above him are the swans. You can see the swans above his head. So he's a great poet. She is shown as Pallas Athena. And if you read the poem below, she is Pallas, and her face and her spirit and her beauty are represented in this picture. Above her head, you can see the coronet of the Countess, which is on top of the Sidney spear, the Sidney phaeon, with, of course, the lighted torches. So she's presenting your wisdom and courage and beauty. And also wearing the Sidney family symbol, which is the spear there, the phaeon, above her head, pointing down like a pen toward her head. Now, let's go back 2 slides. Their younger brother, Robert Sidney, as I told you, collected Phoenix Nest with 10 authors honoring Sir Philip and their uncle, Robert Dudley. It included a poem by the Earl of Oxford, who was called E.O., and Robert Sidney was called R.S. of the Inner Temple. And that's because he occupied the office of Robert Dudley at the Inner Temple. He wasn't a lawyer, but he used that. Later wrote a full sonnet sequence, Pamphylia to Amphilanthus, about her first cousin, William Herbert, and their 2 illegitimate children, who she was hiding. It's a very sad story, actually. And so all of these Sidneys from 2 generations were sonnet writers. Why is that? Robert Sidney, by the way, wrote sonnets to his wife, Barbara. Well, the sonnet is represented in their family symbol. If you look above the head of Robert, he also has a phaeon, a spear, above his head, because that's the family badge shown above his head. Can you see it? The arrow going down to his head, representing his sonnets. In this, it's not only pointing down like a pen on the page, but also there are 3 broad points at the top that converge on one sharp point, like a spear, right? But this also represents an English sonnet. An English sonnet has 3 quatrains, 4 lines, that converge on one strong couplet at the bottom. And that's the point of the spear, the strong point of the Sidney or English sonnet. And those are the sonnets that Shakespeare used, a family symbol of the Sidneys, pointing down on the page like a pen. So let's go forward and talk then about the poems of Mary Sidney. One more. There we go. Now, the signed works of Mary Sidney were mainly written in the 1580s and early 90s. She first published a long book of French translations called The Tragedy of Anthony, which was about Cleopatra's death, by Robert Garnier, published in 1592, but written in 1590. Then she published the Arcadia in 1593, and did other translations such as Petrarch's Triumph of Death, translating from Italian, which you know. Well, who is Petrarch? He was the father of humanism and the Italian Renaissance, and also the creator of great sonnets, the different form sonnets of the Italians. The Triumph of Death was about the death of a gallant lady who became Laura. David's Psalms were the greatest poems and songs of the Bible, right? Philip translated the first 43. Mary completed the 150. And so the full David Psalms is a full book, the Sidney Psalter it's called. Sonnet 100 and 150, the great Psalms of praise, are written as sonnets, rewritten as Sidney sonnets. Her best poems, according to Anne and Robin, are written for the Queen Elizabeth in 1599. In particular, read To the Angel Spirit of His Excellency Sir Philip Sidney, beautifully written. It's actually better than The Phoenix and the Turtle, which was written 2 years later. I've compared them, and they use many of the same words, suggesting her connection to both of those poems. Her, 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 her biographer, Margaret Hanley, concluded that throughout this period, Mary Sidney was writing other works. All of her letters say she was working further and harder on more works. Amelia Bassano said in 1611 that she was writing many greater works. And yet Hannay says all of these seem to have been lost or somehow misattributed to another author. Well, I think I know who that author might have been that was writing all those works between 1580s and 1621 when she died. Recently, the Schluters found 5 poems of hers that were short poems to her family. The title of Hannay's book is called Philip's Phoenix, because when Philip died, she rose out of his ashes to become the new phoenix, the new leader of the Sidney family of poets. Okay, this is just the background. Now I want to talk to you about the works of Shakespeare. We can go to the next slide. Now, what about the poets who wrote Shakespeare's poems? Christopher Marlowe, who wrote Edward II for the Pembrokes in 1593. He said before that Mary Sidney was perhaps the greatest poet of the time. He called her in a dedication, Muse of the poets of our time. She's the one that inspired all the poets through her circle. He asked her to be his patron. Deign to be patron as to thine own adoptive son. He wanted to be her son and have her be his mother patron. The end of this long dedication, which you should read, says, thy virtue, which shall overcome virtue herself, shall likewise overcome even eternity. She is the immortal poet of virtue, according to the greatest playwright of the time, Christopher Marlowe, in the year that he started writing for the Pembrokes. The other poet that wrote the Henry VI plays, Thomas Nash, called her a second Minerva at her temple of Pallas Athena, recognizing her greatness, asking for a job to write. The tutor to her children, who also was fluent in Italian, who went to Italy in 1590 and 91, he said that she was the great patroness of these my humble rhymes, which thou from out thy greatness doth inspire. He became the poet laureate. He said she was the person who inspired all of his work. 20 other poets are listed in Tudor times who write poems to Mary Sidney, and including Philip in many of these. So let's go to the next one. She was considered the leader of poets at the time, in the year when the name Shakespeare was chosen for Venus and Adonis. Not an accident. So of the 5 Pembroke plays that I talk about that are related to Shakespeare, none of them has an author name. The only play of the Earl of Pembroke's men was Marlowe's Edward II. He apparently had been hired around 1590, which I've extracted from several things, including Marlowe's biography. He was known, and he actually got Nash to join the group in 1591. So of the plays that don't have an author's name that have been assigned to Shakespeare in the folio, the most famous is The Taming of a Shrew, which became The Shrew. Titus Andronicus was the earliest play with George Peele. The War of the Roses plays, Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, were begun by Nash in 1591, but all of them show the style of Marlowe. In fact, Marlowe seems to be the major influence on all of these plays. Marlowe was the greatest playwright, and his words and styles are more evident in these Pembroke plays than in any other plays that he didn't sign. Their lead actor that performed these plays many times in 1592 and 3, their lead actor was Richard Burbage, who then was the producer and performer of all the rest of Shakespeare's plays after 1594, Lord Chamberlain's Men and King's Men. Burbage then became the producer of the plays after the Pembrokes closed. Before Burbage took over Shakespeare's plays, there were several other groups like Strang's Men that you know about, Oxford's Men. I'm not going to talk about them as much, but they're all important to the rise of Shakespeare, but not as close as the Pembrokes were to the immediate rise through the presence of Mary Sidney and Richard Burbage. The question, of course, is, was Mary Sidney Herbert an author or an editor or an inspiration of any of these early Shakespeare works that started Shakespeare's career? That's what we're going to discuss. Next slide. The one that's most interesting is Taming of a Shrew. First, because it's the only comedy, and it's the only one that doesn't use another author, that Marlowe is not the major influence. The major influence seems to be Nash, Thomas Nash, and Nash's name is used here in this sonnet. In fact, the words are closest to his last will and testament, the only play that he wrote alone. Why is it linked to Nash? The explanation is in 3 sonnets written for Gabriel Harvey's book called Pierce's Supererogation. I just threw my phone away. Okay. It says that there were 3 sonnets at the start of this book. And these 3 sonnets were written by a woman, the excellent woman, my patroness with her white quill. Who is this? Well, the patroness of Gabriel Harvey was Mary Sidney. She always wrote with a white swan quill shown on her pictures. And so the only woman who was writing a lot at that time with a white quill was the patroness of Gabriel Harvey. This is a picture of her in 1590, a miniature, and shows what she looked like at the time she hired Marlowe with her curly red hair. Let's read her sonnets. The first 2 sonnets say, I really shouldn't talk about this, but I had shrew prose and I had to respond to my enemy. The final one, called Her Old Comedy, concludes, I knew a glorious and braving knight that would be deemed a truculent wight. Of him I scrawled a doughty comedy. This is her old comedy. The name of the braving knight was Sir Bombarduccio, was his cruel name, but Nash Arduccio, the sole brute of fame, like Petruccio, right? See how he brazen fumes at me, poor lass, that must immortalize the kill cow ass. Nash was called the ass because he was a braggart, like Sir Bombarduccio. Furthermore, he wrote Pierce Penniless, attacking the Countess in 1592, which was republished in 93. She was angry at him for 2 reasons. So she wrote her shrew prose, Her Old Comedy, alone as an attack, a reply to Nash. And this poem in Pierce's Supererogation is the revelation. She doesn't use her name. She always hides her name. But she was so angry, she let it out, that she wrote shrew. Is that clear? Any questions about this before we go ahead? I now want to explain why she hated Nash and why she revealed all of this about Nash. Go back, sorry, the last one. Okay. Nash, it turns out, when he worked for her, decided that Astrophel and Stella was so beautiful and it hadn't been published, he would publish it himself. So he took a bad version of Sir Philip's sonnets, Astrophel and Stella, and published it on his own without Mary's permission. Then he wrote his dedication to her saying, I'm revealing that Sidney's poems for the world. I'm the great person who's going to reveal, who's going to out Sir Philip. Needless to say, Mary was furious. It was not only a bad copy, but he was taking credit for Philip's work. And so she fired him right away and removed him from the group. That's why he only started 1 play in the first act, and he's not evident in any other play. She fired him in 1591. He needed the money, though. And so he was so angry, he wrote a reply. His nasty pamphlet, Pierce Penniless, insulting the Countess for not paying him. This was a huge success. Any gossip about nobles was a good topic on the streets. So he called her Dame Niggardess for not paying him. In Pierce Penniless, you can find that word. Furthermore, he called her husband even worse. He called him the devil and placed her circle of poets in the circles of hell, as in Dante's Inferno. So if their circle of poets is now Dante's Inferno, and Pembroke, the kind old man, was the devil, they were furious. This was a huge scandal in 1593 called the War of the Poets. I've dug very deeply into this. So Pembroke withdrew his company in 1593. At the same time, at the end of May, Marlowe was murdered. So there were two big scandals. Nash's nasty pamphlets calling him the devil, and then their poet, Marlowe, was killed, murdered in Deptford, in what was called a bar fight. So the famous Pembroke family was getting a bad reputation. He decided the theater world was no good for him, withdrew his company, and told his wife never to appear again in public. She withdrew from publicity. And after that year, she always used her pen name. And she told everybody else not to use her name because she didn't want to get it sullied by all of these street people. Is that clear? This is the turning point in her life. At that point, she became private and didn't use her name as she had in those sonnets. We can question that if you like. That's the story of why she withdrew from public view. Okay, let's go to the middle plays. Most of the plays were written for Burbage. There are about 20 plays, starting with Romeo and Juliet and Richard III, very great plays. Whoever Shakespeare was, greatly influenced by Marlowe and greatly influenced by the women's view of the Sidney circle, led by a woman. Romeo and Juliet write sonnets to one another. There's a sonnet at start of Act 1, start of Act 2, and then Romeo starts a sonnet to Juliet, the Palmer's sonnet. She finishes it. She already so smart writing sonnets that she finishes it for him. Beautiful sonnet. Remember, Astrophel and Sella was finished by Mary. She is the poet who completed his work as the Countess, just as Juliet concludes Romeo's sonnets. In Much Ado About Nothing, Benedict and Beatrice fight with one another, and then they hide their sonnets. They end, the sonnets reveal their love, and that's the happy ending of the comedy. The comedy Love Labor's Lost is about men who can't write sonnets. So sonnets are right in her thinking at the very time that she stopped writing for the public. In many of these plays, there are very intelligent, strong women. Hermia is the smart woman in Midsummer Night's Dream who doesn't want an arranged marriage. Mary Sidney had an arranged marriage. She had to marry the old Pembroke, 40 years old, 25 years older than she was at 15. So it's a dream about escaping from an arranged marriage. While there's a theater group. Remember, Leicester had a theater group, and they met at Leicester's theater production in Kenilworth, Pembroke and Mary. So Midsummer Night's Dream is very much the story of the Pembrokes getting married. I mentioned Beatrice in Much Ado. Portia is the brilliant woman who solves riddles, who creates riddles, and then solves the problem in the court of law as the lawyer. She then resolves the dispute between the merchants and Shylock with her brilliant don't touch his blood, right? Rosalind in As You Like It is the brilliant person in the Forest of Arden. These are the best women's roles ever written, according to Sir Mark Rylance last year. Why do the women always get the best roles and usually have the last word over the men that they outsmart? Well, Shakespeare must have known women, huh? Now let's go and talk about the other works. You can go one down. Let's talk about the poems of Shakespeare. 5 major poems. Venus and Adonis and Lucrece are based on Ovid poems. The Phoenix and the Turtle, 1601, is about two poets who are immolated together and go to heaven, are immortalized together. The Phoenix is a female and the turtle is a male dove. Shakespeare's Sonnets, I'm arguing, is about a woman poet, the mother of William Herberts. A Lover's Complaint is about a poet horseman who seduces the lover, but it's told from the viewpoint of the lover. In all these 5 poems, who's the protagonist? In every case, it's the woman, the goddess of love, the noble woman Lucrece. The brilliant phoenix that rises from the ashes is a woman. Shakespeare's Sonnets is the genius poet, our ever-living poet. And the lover is the one, the gentle maid, who suffers when she's seduced by the poet horseman. So the women are always the protagonists. They're generally noble women or goddesses. The words in all of these poems have been analyzed recently by computers. And even the computers say that the words and the word frequencies are most like Sidney circle poems, closest to Astrophel and Stella and Samuel Daniels' Delia, both dedicated to Mary Sidney, closest to the Psalms of David, translated by Mary and Philip Sidney. The Phoenix and the Turtle is closest to the words of Angel Spirit of Sir Philip Sidney, written by Mary Sidney, and so on. Now I'm going to show you one messy slide that summarizes these data that was placed in New Oxford Shakespeare. This is all the words in the poems of 254 plays and poems of the Elizabethan era, including Shakespeare, Spenser, Chapman, all the great playwrights as well. All of Shakespeare's poems fall in cluster 1, and this is cluster 1, and they are closest to the Sidney circle of poets. Cluster 4 is the early plays. Those are all show that the Shakespeare plays are most like Marlowe. So Marlowe is the center of the early plays rather. All the poems are closer to the Sidneys, with the exception of Nash. Okay, let's now find Shakespeare's sonnets. It's right in the middle of this starlight cluster, and Shakespeare's sonnets are shown in purple. Next to it is Lucrece in purple and Venus and Adonis. That shows that the poems of Shakespeare are linked, probably have the same author or the same influences. Just as close as Venus and Adonis is Philip Sidney's Astrophel above, and Samuel Daniels' Delia, just as close as Venus and Adonis. Above Philip Sidney is Mary Sidney Roth's sonnets. Below, to the left, is the only one of Mary Sidney's works, Mary Sidney's Psalms, 44 to 63, mislabeled by the author as sonnets. They're psalms. 2 of them are sonnets. The others that you may not recognize, Raleigh wrote dedications, as did Donne, to Philip Sidney and Mary. To the right, you see John Davies. He wrote many tributes to Mary Sidney because he was her secretary, her personal secretary. That was the handwriter for the Psalms that were given to Queen Elizabeth, and wrote many tributes to Mary Sidney. In other words, all of these names in red are poets of the Sidney circle, with the exception of Shakespeare. Why was Shakespeare influenced so much by these Sidney poems? By the way, Chapman and Spenser, they're completely separate. Shakespeare's poems are linked to the Sidneys, not to the other great poets of the time. You get the idea? It's a complicated picture. This is basically all word frequencies thrown into a computer. This is the unbiased output of the computer saying what is closest in word frequency, with my comments in red. Let's go down to the next conclusion. This now is the cover page, the famous cover page in 1593 of Venus and Adonis, with a woman goddess at the top there, and then the title page. Now, Buxton has analyzed Venus and Adonis and compared it to Ovid's Venus and Adonis that influenced it. Ovid's Venus and Adonis is about the relationship in which beautiful Adonis talks to Venus and says, I'm not going to have an affair with you, right? This Venus and Adonis is much more about the goddess. The goddess tries to seduce him and she does all the talking, most of the talking. He says, no, I don't want to have an affair. And he goes off to his hunt with a boar. The goddess is disappointed and has suffering. Why does he want to hunt a boar? It's very dangerous. He dies and she is distraught because of his death. In other words, Buxton concludes, this is about the suffering of Venus on the death of someone who dies in a battle with a boar. Philip Sidney died in battle of a wound in his thigh in 1586. Many of the poets wrote poems about his death. Interestingly, Adonis dies of a wound in the thigh, and so Buxton concludes that this must be an elegy on Philip Sidney. If it's an elegy on Philip Sidney, who's Venus? The sister he left behind, the goddess of Minerva. She now is the goddess of love. Another thing that suggests that it's Mary Sidney is the quotation below. The quotation below, which is from the most famous poem of Ovid. It was translated by both Marlowe and by Johnson, concluding that this is advice to poets. The quotation says, Apollo, lead me to the poet's springs. This is what Ovid tells poets, go to Castelia Springs. Why does the poet include this quotation? It's because Apollo is Philip, and she's the one that has taken over the Poet's Springs, the school for poetry, which fights for virtue. And that's what Ovid says, all poets should fight for virtue. This quotation is the message to go to Mary Sidney's poet's school following Apollo, which is Philip, who is Adonis. This quotation of Ovid is stolen in order to advertise Mary Sidney's School for Poets, in my opinion. That's a bit of a reach, but that seems to be the suggestion here. Let's go to the next page, the famous dedication. Let's go back to the previous one. I want to talk about what's said here. The next page of Venus and Adonis says, first heir of my invention, signed William Shakespeare. It's the first time the name Shakespeare is ever used in a publication, just below the dedication. So why does the author talk about a son, a first heir? Well, the poems are in a sense the child of the author, but the first heir of Mary Sidney is William Herbert. William Herbert is her first heir. How did she write her poems? Her inventive pen, which wrote her poems, was her family symbol, the Sidney spear. The shaking Sidney spear then represents the family name Shakespeare. Sidney. So shaking spear is referring to her Sidney spear. This suggests that the name William Shakespeare was chosen in 1593 to represent the forename of her first heir and her Sidney spear for her invention of her pen. That's a stretch too. But again, we now can understand why this is a story about Ovid and Venus and Adonis and how this pen name was chosen. Is that clear? Nobody has said this before. We believe that Venus and Adonis was her first poem as Shakespeare, reveals her pen name, why she uses this quotation, and why it's about the death of Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Sylvia, do you want to take a break now and get some comments? Or do you want me to go ahead and explain the sonnets?
Go ahead. I haven't had any questions yet. Please write your questions in the chat.
This is a very strong argument, and I hope we can get some criticism. But nobody has claimed that Venus and Adonis was written by Mary Sidney about her brother using her new pen name that became the pen name of Shakespeare for the rest of that career. Let's go ahead to the next one now. talk about the other poems. Phoenix and the Turtle is in a book called Rosalind's Complaint. Rosalind is Beauty's Rose, written in the same year for As You Like It. The title page of Rosalind's Complaint says, these are allegorical poems on the fate of the turtle and his phoenix. The phoenix is a woman, the turtle dove is the one who dies then with the phoenix. The conclusion of the poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, is the last line of the quatrain says, co-supremes and stars of love. Who are they? Well, Philip Sidney was Astrophel, who loved his star, Stella, right? He's the star lover, and his poems are about the stars of love with Stella. Who is Mary Sidney? She's the phoenix that rises from his ashes. My interpretation of this allegorical poem is that they're about Philip Sidney, the star lover, and the woman, the phoenix who rises from his ashes to be the co-supreme. She's now become his equal. The co-supreme's now saying, okay, Philip, I'm now as good as you are. In terms of this conclusion, other people have concluded this must be Queen Elizabeth, because she was always used in allegorical poems, right? But she was Oriana. Would Queen Elizabeth ever allow a man to be her equal? Never would allow a co-supreme. That's why she never married. The co-supremes are the two poets who've risen to the equal status, not Queen Elizabeth and her equal. That's why I'm pretty sure that this must be Mary and Philip. She, of course, becomes Philip's phoenix to his turtle. Ben Jonson then writes the following poem. Ben Jonson, remember, wrote the first folio poem, saying it must be the actor. In 1601, he concludes in the Phoenix Analyzed, the next poem after The Phoenix and the Turtle of Shakespeare. He concludes in this quatrain, let no man receive it for a fable. It's not a joke. If a bird so amiable do turn into a woman, an equal woman, the new phoenix. Jonson is saying here, I believe, don't laugh at this. This is Mary Sidney. She is the one who's become the phoenix, the great poet for the subsequent ages. Jonson knew it in 1601, and he confesses it in his poem After Phoenix and the Turtle. Strong statement, all consistent with Mary Sidney being Shakespeare that writes the Phoenix and the Turtle about Philip and herself, using the words, the same words she uses in her Angel Spirit poem to Sir Philip 2 years later. Let's go to the next slide. A lover's complaint, what about that? That's what's tacked on to the end of the sonnets. It's about a poor girl who's fallen for a poet horseman. The poet horseman sounds a lot like Philip Sidney. Just below the title, where she's complaining about being seduced by this charming poet horseman, is the words in the second line, a plaintful story from a sistering vale. She's his sister. Is this Mary Sidney's sad story of her poet brother's seductive power? At the end, after the sonnets, she is apologizing, I think, for having fallen for poetry. But in the end of the lover's complaint, she doesn't apologize. She says, what I should do again for such a state, such a sake, I would do it all again. And so she, at the end, she says, even though I was sad, even though I suffered because of my love, I would do it all again to be the great poet. That's my conclusion, is that she is talking about her legacy, that she would do it again. Okay, what about her name? As I told you, she never used her name in her poems or plays. I couldn't find any character who's named Mary in all of Shakespeare's plays, a common name, Mary. No one uses that name directly. No one uses the name Sidney or Pembroke. And so consequently, they do use Henry because they're kings, right? She doesn't care about his name, but she doesn't use Herbert. She only suggests that name through all of these family symbols, through all of these messages, these hidden messages of Spears and her life story. So why didn't she use her name? Well, Nash's insulting pamphlets were very embarrassing to her family. She decided to avoid the public conflict. She preferred her privacy. Her poets like Nash, and Harvey, and Davies, they all wrote that they were forbidden to use her name. For example, Davies at the end in 1601 says, "Oh, do not tell that still your favor seeks." And then he compliments her for her great new book that he just received in 1610, perhaps the Sonnets. But you couldn't admit that she was Shakespeare, or otherwise her cover would be blown and the family might be embarrassed. We believe that she agreed with her sons and her husband, her old husband, never to reveal their name, which could lead to embarrassment with the queen. That's our opinion again. So let's go to the next one, and we'll now jump ahead. So all of these poems, 3 of these poems seem to be about her and Philip, right? I'm not sure about the rape. That's a little bit dicier. Who raped Lucrece? Who raped Mary? But it was about Ovid. And remember, the people that loved Ovid most, according to Marlowe's biographer Riggs, were Marlowe, who translated Ovid, and Mary, who told all the poets to read Ovid. A lot of people didn't like Ovid because he was a pagan, but the poets loved Ovid. And they got into a bit of trouble because Nash and some of the clergy didn't like the pagan Ovid to be loved that much. Mary and Marlowe were the ones that started Ovid. Marlowe wrote Hero and Leander. I believe Mary wrote Venus and Lucrece. That's how she revealed herself through these poems, by showing she was a great poet like Ovid, and then using his advice to attract other poets, and finally writing the great poems that we know of Shakespeare. That's the end of that section. The most important revelation of all of Shakespeare's work is the sonnets. I'm only going to talk about the dedication and the conclusions. The famous dedication to W.H., for me, is a series of riddles, puzzles, like Shakespeare loved riddles, right? Mary and Philip loved riddles. They used to play with riddles. Let's read the riddle in the dedication. The dedication is 6 lines to W.H. and 6 lines to our ever-living poet, as you can see in a downward arrow. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H. Okay, why is he an only begetter of ensuing sonnets? The only begotten son is Jesus, the son of Mary. This is an only begetter son because William Herbert was her first son, the one who was needed to beget future sons. Future sons are ensuing sons. Little sons are sonnets. Remember, sonetto means song, but in English, sonnet means little son. So this is a double meaning, a triple meaning. Poems as little songs, boys as little sonnets. O thou my lovely boy. 6 lines to her son, the only begetter son, William. The next 6 lines are from the poet, our ever-living poet. Our poet is the poet of the family. The family wants a son in the first line of the first sonnet. So it's our poet because she was the poet of the family. She wishes that the well-wishing adventurer will read her poems. That's the future. The future of the poems is from readers like us. We're the adventurers that go into the story about Shakespeare, the ever-living poet. I hope you're listening today. So the conclusions are in Sonnet 126. They're not a sonnet. It's 12 lines and 6 couplets. 1, 2, 6. 12, 6 is the key to the number 12 lines like the dedication, 6 to the sun and life, 6 to the poet and the meaning of life. It's just amazingly brilliant the way it's written. The first couplet is to, O thou, my lovely boy, who in thy power doth hold time's fickle glass, his sickle hour. He has a sickle and hourglass. That's Father Time. The boy has become Father Time. This represents the themes of the sonnets of beauty versus time. Beauty, you get old. Women become beautiful and wise. Men become old and die and foolish. Throughout the sonnets, there's the contrast between beauty and age, with men becoming old like Henry and women becoming beautiful because they fight for their sons and their beautiful sonnets. How do we know this? The third couplet says, if nature, sovereign mistress over wrack, as thou goest onward, still will pluck thee back. This shows the power of Mother Nature over life. She has the power over her son, whom she worships as an only begetter, and she has the power over death. Mothers love their sons. This is about mother love, the greatest of all love, the most permanent of all love, because sons produce progeny. The meaning of life is about fathers who die and mothers that want children. That's life. The second part of the sonnets is about the poet. Our ever-living poet becomes she. 8 times the word she is used to describe the poet in the second part of the dedication. How does the poet work? She keeps thee to this purpose, that her skill may time disgrace and wretched minutes kill. She produces delight. All poets, all artists have to produce delight first and then produce meaning. The first couplet is about delight. The last couplet is about the meaning of life. This is the most important couplet in all of Shakespeare's works. Her audit, notice audits in italics in the original. Her audit, though delayed, answered must be. And her quietus is to render thee. Her audit is her summing up of his sins and his virtues. Mothers judge their children, right? Her quietus is her final judgment on whether his life has been worthwhile. And she renders him her portrait in poetry, but also rendering his butchering, cutting her apart with her judgments, her final judgments. And so this final 6 lines about the poet are about the poet Mary judging her only begetter's son and rendering her final judgments and her final revelations as the author of Shakespeare's sonnets. Okay, that's it.